Why you wouldn't survive a Spartan childhood. It starts with abandonment. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker, something most of us can barely imagine. We're diving into what it was really like to grow up in ancient Sparta. Forget the Hollywood warriors and epic battle scenes. The truth is, you probably wouldn't survive a single day as a Spartan child. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just been born in ancient Sparta. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, your survival depends on a committee of old men who've never changed a diaper in their lives. Within hours of your birth, you're not being cooed over by relatives or wrapped in soft blankets. Instead, you're being carried to a group of elders known as the Gerousia, who will examine you like a piece of livestock at market. This isn't a blessing ceremony, it's an inspection. They're checking for deformities, weakness, any sign that you might not become the perfect killing machine Sparta demands. Your tiny fingers, your muscle tone, even the way you cry, everything is being evaluated. These men aren't doctors. They're not child development experts. They're warriors who believe that only the strongest deserve to live. If you pass this grotesque audition, congratulations. You get to go home with your parents, for now. But if you show any sign of weakness, any hint of imperfection, you're carried to the apothete, a chasm on Mount Tagetus. There's no appeal process, no second opinion, no mercy. You're simply left to die, exposed to the elements, abandoned by the very society that brought you into existence. Think about that for a moment, before you can even focus your eyes properly, before you've taken your first real breath of life. A group of strangers has already decided whether you deserve to exist. This isn't natural selection, this is manufactured brutality, designed to create a society where compassion is seen as weakness and human life has value only if it serves the state. But here's what makes it even more chilling. Your parents don't get a say. Your mother, who just endured hours of labor, who felt you move inside her for months, she has to hand you over and wait for the verdict. Your father, no matter how much he might want to protect you, is powerless. The state owns you from the moment you draw breath. And this is just the beginning. Because if you're deemed worthy of life, if you somehow pass this barbaric test, what awaits you isn't a normal childhood filled with play and learning and love. What awaits you is a systematic destruction of everything we consider human. You're about to enter a world where weakness is punished, emotions are suppressed, and childhood itself is seen as an obstacle to overcome. The Spartans didn't see this as cruelty, they saw it as necessity. In their minds, they were creating the ultimate warriors, the perfect citizens, the strongest society on earth. But what they were really creating was a culture of fear, where survival meant abandoning your humanity before you were old enough to understand what humanity even meant. So as you lie there, having passed your first test, having earned your right to exist, remember this. In Sparta, being born is just the beginning of your trials, and every day that follows will be designed to break you down, build you up, and turn you into something that barely resembles the innocent child you are right now. The men who just examined you, they're not done with you. They'll be back, and next time, they won't be checking your body for flaws. They'll be coming for your soul. But surviving the inspection was only the beginning, because once a Spartan infant passed that initial test, once they were deemed worthy enough to breathe Spartan air, the real nightmare began. And it started with a choice that would haunt every mother for the rest of her life. You see, in most ancient civilizations, a mother's bond with her child was considered sacred, unbreakable. But Sparta wasn't most civilizations. Sparta was a machine designed to produce warriors, and machines don't have room for sentiment. So when that Spartan baby reached the age of 7, when they were still small enough to need their mother's protection, still young enough to cry for comfort in the night, the state would come knocking. And the message was simple: your child no longer belongs to you, they belong to us. This wasn't a gradual transition, no gentle weaning from family life. This was immediate, brutal, and absolute. Boys were ripped from their mother's arms and marched away to begin their training in the agoge, Sparta's legendary and horrifying military school. Girls, while allowed to remain at home slightly longer, faced their own version of systematic conditioning that would strip away every trace of typical childhood. But let's focus on the boys first, because their journey into hell began at 7 years old. Picture this scene if you can. A small child, barely tall enough to reach his mother's waist, being handed over to strangers whose job it is to break him down completely. No goodbye hugs, no promises that everything would be okay, no reassurance that mommy and daddy would visit soon. Because in Sparta, love was weakness, attachment was a liability, and the state understood that if you wanted to create the perfect soldier, you had to start by destroying the perfect child. The boys were organized into groups called agoge, essentially military units composed of children. Each group was overseen by older boys, teenagers who had already survived years of the system and had internalized its cruelty so completely that they became willing participants in torturing the next generation. It was a cycle of abuse that perpetuated itself, where the victims became the victimizers, where survival meant learning to inflict the same pain that had been inflicted upon you. These weren't summer camps or boarding schools. These were institutions designed to forge human weapons through systematic deprivation and controlled suffering. The boys slept on beds made of reeds. They had to gather themselves, using their bare hands to break the sharp stems. No blankets in winter, no shelter from the elements, no comfort when they were sick, scared, or homesick. And homesickness that was beaten out of them quickly, because missing your mother, crying for your father, longing for the warmth of a family meal, these were signs of weakness that had to be eliminated immediately and permanently. The food situation was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the agoge. The boys were deliberately kept on the edge of starvation, given just enough nutrition to survive, but never enough to feel satisfied. This wasn't an oversight or a budget constraint. This was intentional policy, designed to keep them lean, hungry, and desperate. But here's the twisted genius of the system. The boys were expected to supplement their meager rations by stealing food from the surrounding countryside, not just allowed to steal, but required to. It was part of their training, a way to develop cunning, stealth, and resourcefulness. The catch? If they were caught stealing, they were punished severely, not for the theft itself, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. So you had children, barely old enough to tie their own shoes, creeping through the darkness like tiny criminals, risking brutal beatings to obtain enough food to keep themselves alive. And if they succeeded, if they managed to steal without detection, they were praised for their skill. If they failed, they were whipped for their incompetence. It was a system that taught children that survival required deception, that morality was a luxury they couldn't afford, and that the world was a hostile place where only the clever and ruthless could thrive. These weren't lessons learned in classrooms or through gentle instruction. These were lessons carved into their bodies through hunger, fear, and pain. And speaking of pain, the Spartans had turned physical suffering into an art form. The boys endured regular beatings, not as punishment for wrongdoing, but as routine conditioning to build pain tolerance. They were forced to fight each other, sometimes to the point of serious injury, all while their instructors watched and evaluated their performance like judges at a particularly violent sporting event. There was a famous ritual called the diamastagosis, where boys were flogged at the altar of Artemis Orthia. This wasn't a rare occurrence or a special punishment. This was an annual event, a religious ceremony where children were beaten bloody in front of cheering crowds. The goal was to see who could endure the most pain without crying out, without begging for mercy, without showing any sign of human weakness. Some boys died during these beatings, and when they did, they were celebrated as heroes who had achieved the ultimate Spartan virtue, the ability to suffer in silence. Their deaths weren't tragedies to be mourned, they were examples to be emulated, but perhaps the most insidious aspect of the agoge was how it weaponized the boys against each other. Competition wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. Every meal, every exercise, every moment of their lives was turned into a contest where there were winners and losers, where showing kindness to a struggling peer was seen as a character flaw. The boys learned to view their companions not as friends or brothers, but as obstacles to overcome, competitors to defeat, potential weaknesses in the group that needed to be identified and eliminated. Bonds of genuine affection were actively discouraged, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment of who was useful and who was expendable. And through it all, through every beating and betrayal, through every hungry night and terrifying day, the boys were told that this was normal, that this was what it meant to be Spartan, that children in other cities were weak and soft and worthless because they hadn't been blessed with this opportunity to suffer properly. The psychological manipulation was as brutal as the physical abuse. The boys were convinced that their pain had meaning, that their sacrifice was noble, that their childhood was a small price to pay for the glory of becoming true Spartan warriors. They were taught to take pride in their ability to endure, to see their suffering as evidence of their superiority over lesser peoples who coddled their young. By the time these boys reached adolescence, they had been so thoroughly conditioned that they genuinely believed this system was not only necessary but beautiful. They looked forward to the day when they could oversee the next generation of children, when they could pass on the lessons that had been carved into their own souls through years of systematic cruelty. And that's perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Spartan system. It didn't just destroy individual children. It created a culture where the destruction of childhood was seen as sacred duty, where love was redefined as harm, where the most natural human instincts were twisted into something unrecognizable. The boys who survived the agoge didn't emerge as well-adjusted adults who happened to be good at fighting. They emerged as damaged human beings who had learned to mistake brutality for strength, isolation for independence, and emotional numbness for courage. They became men who could kill without hesitation, but who struggled to love without fear. And this was considered the ideal outcome. This was what Sparta was trying to achieve. A population of human weapons who had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they no longer remembered what it felt like to be truly human. Part 3. The Spartan Conditioning Machine. As the harsh realities of agoge life set in, the boys quickly learned that survival meant adapting to a system designed to strip away every trace of their former selves. This wasn't just military training, it was psychological reconstruction on a massive scale. The Spartans had perfected something far more sophisticated than simple boot camp. They had created a conditioning machine that would systematically break down a child's natural instincts and rebuild them according to Spartan ideals. The barracks themselves were instruments of control. Cramped, cold, and deliberately uncomfortable, these stone buildings housed dozens of boys in spaces barely adequate for half that number. There were no beds, only thin straw mats that provided little cushion against the hard floors. No blankets except what the boys could fashion from stolen materials. No privacy, no personal space, no moment where a child could retreat into himself and remember what life had been like before. Sleep became a luxury rather than a necessity. The boys were woken at irregular intervals throughout the night for surprise drills, punishments, or simple harassment from their older peers. This sleep deprivation wasn't accidental. It was a calculated strategy to keep the children in a constant state of vulnerability and dependence on the group. An exhausted mind is more easily molded, more willing to accept new patterns of thought and behavior. The daily routine was relentless in its monotony and brutality. Before dawn, the boys would be roused for their first meal, if it could be called that. A thin gruel made from barley, mixed with pig's blood and salt, served in portions deliberately too small to satisfy growing bodies. This black broth, or melisomos, was famous throughout Greece for its revolting taste and meager nutrition. Foreign visitors who sampled it reportedly declared they finally understood why Spartans were so eager to die in battle. But the inadequate food served multiple purposes beyond simple cost cutting. Chronic hunger made the boys aggressive, desperate, and willing to do anything for an extra morsel. It taught them that comfort was weakness, that the body's demands were secondary to duty. Most importantly, it created a shared experience of suffering that bound the group together while isolating them from the outside world, where people ate proper meals and lived in comfort. Physical training dominated the morning hours, but this wasn't the organized athletics we might imagine. Instead, it was a series of increasingly brutal exercises designed to test pain tolerance rather than build strength. Boys were forced to run barefoot across rocky terrain until their feet bled. They practiced combat with wooden weapons that left welts and bruises across their bodies. They were made to crawl through thorn bushes, swim in icy water, and endure beatings with minimal reaction. The instructors, called paidonomoi, were themselves products of this system, men who had survived the agoge and now perpetuated its methods with the zealousness of the converted. They showed no mercy to weakness, no sympathy for tears, no patience for anything that resembled normal childhood behavior. A boy who cried was beaten. A boy who complained was starved. A boy who showed fear was humiliated before his peers until he learned to bury those emotions so deep they might never surface again. Perhaps most psychologically damaging was the systematic destruction of family bonds and personal identity. The boys were forbidden to speak of their homes, their mothers, their previous lives. They were given new names, often derived from military virtues or Spartan heroes. Their personal belongings were confiscated and destroyed. Any letters or gifts from family were intercepted and used as opportunities for punishment and mockery. The instructors would deliberately turn the boys against each other through a system of collective punishment. If one boy failed at a task, the entire group would suffer. If one boy was caught stealing food, which was actually encouraged as a survival skill, his bunkmates would face reduced rations. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and mutual suspicion, where forming genuine friendships became dangerous and personal loyalty was subordinated to group survival. The older boys, those who had survived several years of this treatment, became enforcers of the system. They had learned that the only way to gain any measure of safety or status was to become more brutal than their tormentors. These teenagers, themselves still children in any normal society, were given authority over the younger boys and used it with the cruelty that only the traumatized can inflict on others. Every aspect of daily life was regulated and monitored. The boys learned to speak in short, clipped sentences that conveyed information without emotion. They were taught to eat quickly and silently, to sleep lightly and wake instantly, to endure pain without expression. They learned that asking questions was dangerous, that showing curiosity about the outside world was weakness, that expressing individual preferences was selfish and un-Spartan. The psychological manipulation extended to their developing sexuality and relationships with others. The older men who supervised them often formed intense emotional and physical relationships with promising boys, relationships that were simultaneously protective and exploitative. This created another layer of confusion and dependency as boys learned that their safety and advancement might depend on their willingness to submit to these arrangements. Religious instruction became another tool of control. The boys were taught that their suffering was sacred, pleasing to the gods who had chosen Sparta for greatness. They learned that their pain was a sacrifice on the altar of Spartan superiority, that their tears were offerings to Ares and Artemis. The gods themselves, they were told, had ordained this system and would punish any who tried to escape or resist it. By the end of their first year in the agoge, most boys had been fundamentally changed. The bright curiosity of childhood had been replaced by a grim focus on survival. The natural affection and trust that children show toward adults had been replaced by wariness and calculation. The instinctive bonds between brothers and friends had been replaced by competitive relationships based on hierarchy and utility. They had learned to measure their worth not by their happiness or their potential, but by their ability to endure suffering without complaint. They had internalized the Spartan belief that pain was virtue, that deprivation was strength, that emotional numbness was the highest form of self-control. They had become, in other words, exactly what the system intended them to become: young soldiers who valued nothing more than their ability to serve the state that had created them. The most tragic aspect of this transformation was how completely the boys accepted it. They didn't see themselves as victims of abuse, but as chosen ones undergoing sacred trials. They didn't recognize their trauma as damage, but as tempering that made them stronger. They had been conditioned so thoroughly that they would spend the rest of their lives defending and perpetuating the very system that had robbed them of their childhood, their individuality, and their capacity for normal human relationships. This was the true genius of Spartan education. It didn't just create soldiers, it created believers. Men who would never question the system because they had been taught that questioning was weakness, that doubt was cowardice, that any criticism of Sparta was tantamount to betraying everything that made them special. The agoge didn't just break boys down and build them up again. It convinced them that the breaking was the most important thing that had ever happened to them. And so the cycle continued as each generation of traumatized boys grew into men who would subject the next generation to the same brutalities, believing with absolute conviction that they were giving them the greatest gift possible, the chance to become Spartan. By now, you've survived your first full night in the agoge, assuming you didn't freeze to death or get beaten senseless by your fellow trainees. But here's the thing about Spartan childhood: surviving one night was just the entry fee. What came next was years of systematic brutality designed to strip away every trace of softness, every hint of individual identity, every natural human impulse toward comfort or compassion. The agoge wasn't just harsh training. It was a machine for manufacturing obedient killers, and that machine ran on a very specific fuel: hunger, pain, and fear. Every single day was engineered to push you past what you thought were your limits, then push you further still. Because the Spartans understood something that modern people often miss. If you want to control someone completely, you don't just break their body, you break their spirit, their sense of self, their ability to imagine any other way of living. Let's talk about food, or rather, the deliberate lack of it. You've already tasted the black broth, that revolting mixture that barely qualified as nutrition. But what you didn't know yet was that this wasn't just bad cooking, it was calculated starvation. The Spartans deliberately underfed the boys in the agoge, not because they couldn't afford better food, but because hunger was a weapon. A hungry child is a desperate child. A desperate child will do anything to survive, including betraying their closest friends for a scrap of bread. And that's exactly what the Spartans wanted. They would occasionally leave food lying around, just enough for one or two boys, and then watch as the group turned on itself. Brothers who had shared a sleeping mat the night before would fight viciously over a piece of stale cheese. Best friends would inform on each other's weaknesses in exchange for an extra portion of that disgusting porridge. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. The instructors would encourage these betrayals, rewarding the boys who showed the most ruthless willingness to sacrifice others for their own survival. They called it teaching resourcefulness and competitive spirit. What it really taught was that loyalty was conditional, that trust was dangerous, and that in the end, everyone was alone. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being 7 years old and learning that the person sleeping next to you, the person you'd begun to think of as a brother, would sell you out for a crust of bread. Imagine realizing that kindness was weakness, that showing concern for others made you a target, that the only way to survive was to become as cold and calculating as your captors. But the Spartans weren't done with you yet. Physical conditioning was the next layer of this systematic dehumanization. Every morning before dawn, you'd be dragged from your inadequate bedding and forced to run. Not jog, run. Full sprint, barefoot, across rocky terrain that would shred your feet until they were more callous than skin. The instructors would set an impossible pace, knowing that some boys would fall behind. Those who couldn't keep up faced immediate punishment, beatings, loss of what little food they had, public humiliation in front of the group. But here's the truly insidious part. They also punished the boys who were still running. If you had the energy left to help a fallen comrade, clearly you weren't pushing yourself hard enough. So you learned to step over the collapsed bodies of other children. You learned to ignore their gasps for help, their tears, their pleas, because stopping to help meant joining them in their punishment, and the survival instinct they'd been carefully cultivating told you that your own suffering mattered more than anyone else's. The wrestling and combat training followed the same brutal logic. These weren't friendly sparring matches or instructional demonstrations. They were gladiatorial contests where serious injury was not just possible, but expected. Boys would be thrown into a circle and told to fight until one couldn't continue. No rules, no protective gear, no mercy. Broken bones were common, concussions were routine, permanent disabilities weren't unusual, and if you showed any reluctance to inflict maximum damage on your opponent, if you held back out of basic human decency, you'd find yourself facing not just one opponent, but several, with the instructors explaining that hesitation in battle meant death for yourself and your comrades. The most psychologically damaging aspect of all this wasn't the pain itself. It was the way the system forced you to become complicit in your own destruction. You weren't just a victim of this brutality. You were required to participate in it, to inflict it on others, to internalize its logic as your own. When you beat another child unconscious in the wrestling circle, you weren't just following orders. You were proving your worth, earning your place, showing that you deserved to survive when others didn't. The system made you grateful for the opportunity to brutalize your peers, because the alternative was being brutalized yourself. And slowly, inevitably, something fundamental changed inside you. The natural empathy that children are born with, the instinctive desire to help others and form connections, began to wither and die. It had to. In the agoge, those impulses were not just useless, they were actively dangerous. You learned to suppress any emotional response to suffering, whether your own or others. Tears became impossible. Laughter became suspicious. The only safe emotions were anger and determination, and even those had to be carefully controlled and channeled in approved directions. The Spartans had achieved something remarkable and terrifying. They had taken children who were born with the full range of human emotions and systematically eliminated everything except the capacity for violence and obedience. They had created not just soldiers, but machines, human-shaped weapons that could think and plan, but could no longer feel in any meaningful way. This wasn't an accident or a side effect of harsh training. This was the entire point. Because the Spartans understood that truly effective killers aren't born, they're made, and the process of making them requires destroying everything that makes them human first. By age 7, the real torture was just beginning. What you experienced as an infant was merely the appetizer. The main course of Spartan brutality was called the agoges, and it would consume the next 13 years of your life like a slow-burning fire designed to forge you into something barely recognizable as human. The agoge wasn't a school. It wasn't even a military academy. It was a systematic program of controlled trauma, engineered over generations to strip away every soft human instinct and replace it with cold, calculated obedience. When Spartan boys were torn from their families at 7, they weren't just leaving home. They were entering a machine designed to break them down completely before rebuilding them as weapons. The transition was deliberately jarring. One day, you're a child with a mother's embrace and a father's protection. The next, you're property of the state, assigned to a barracks with dozens of other boys who will become your new family, your rivals, and potentially your executioners. The message was clear from hour 1. Your old life is dead. Your old self is weak, and weakness will not be tolerated. The physical conditions alone would have broken most children from other societies. Spartan boys slept on beds made of rushes they had to gather themselves from the river, using only their bare hands to tear the reeds from the muddy banks. No blankets were provided, regardless of season. In winter, they were expected to endure the cold as training for the hardships of war. In summer, they sweltered in stifling barracks with no relief. Food was deliberately insufficient. The daily rations were calculated to keep boys on the edge of hunger, never quite starving, but never satisfied. This wasn't an oversight or a sign of poverty. Sparta was wealthy enough to feed its children properly. The hunger was intentional, designed to make them desperate, cunning, and willing to do anything to survive. Boys were encouraged to steal food, but if caught, they were beaten savagely, not for stealing, but for being caught. The lesson was clear. Take what you need, but be clever enough not to get caught. The beatings were constant and ritualized. Every infraction, no matter how minor, was met with violence. Speak out of turn, receive 10 lashes, move too slowly 20, show fear 50. The older boys, those who had survived longer in the system, were given authority to discipline the younger ones. This created a hierarchy of brutality where survival meant either enduring abuse or becoming an abuser yourself. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the agoge was how it turned natural human bonds into tools of control. Boys were organized into small groups called agoge, bands of 8 to 12 children who lived, trained, and fought together. At first glance, this might seem like the system was encouraging friendship and brotherhood. In reality, it was creating a laboratory for psychological manipulation. Within each agela, boys were pitted against each other in constant competition. They competed for food, for sleeping spots, for the approval of their handlers. They were taught to watch each other constantly, reporting any sign of weakness or rebellion. Trust became dangerous because the boy who shared your bread today might be the one who reported your tears tomorrow. The older boys who supervised them, called Irenes, were typically between 18 and 20 years old. These young men had survived the worst of the agoge themselves, and now found themselves in the peculiar position of having power over the next generation. Many had been broken so completely by their own experiences that they wielded their authority with a cruelty that would have shocked their own tormentors. They understood that mercy was weakness, and weakness was death. The Irines didn't just supervise, they participated in the boys' degradation. They forced younger children to fight each other for entertainment, sometimes to the point of serious injury or death. They withheld food as punishment and distributed it as reward, creating artificial famines and feast cycles that kept the boys in a constant state of anxiety about their next meal. Sexual abuse was also woven into the fabric of the system, though it was disguised as mentorship and tradition. Older boys and young men were encouraged to form relationships with younger boys that were both educational and exploitative. These relationships were presented as noble and character building, but they were fundamentally about power and control. A boy who resisted these advances might find himself isolated, denied food, or subjected to even worse treatment. The psychological pressure was relentless. Boys learned quickly that showing emotion was dangerous. Crying brought beatings, expressions of homesickness were met with mockery and punishment. Even positive emotions were suspect. Laughing too loudly or showing too much enthusiasm could be interpreted as a lack of seriousness about their training. Sleep deprivation was another tool in the arsenal of control. Boys were woken at random hours for surprise inspections, forced marches, or combat exercises. They learned to sleep lightly, always ready to spring into action. Rest became a luxury that could be taken away at any moment, keeping them in a constant state of exhaustion that made resistance more difficult. The educational component of the agoge was minimal and brutal. Boys learned to read and write, but only enough to follow orders and maintain military records. Mathematics was limited to basic calculations needed for warfare. History was taught through stories of Spartan victories and the consequences of cowardice. Music and dance were included, but only as they related to military marching and battle coordination. Physical training was designed to inflict pain as much as build strength. Boys ran barefoot over rough terrain until their feet were bloody and calloused. They practiced combat with real weapons that could and did cause serious injuries. Wrestling matches continued until one participant was unconscious or seriously injured. Swimming lessons took place in cold rivers, where drowning was a real possibility. The most psychologically damaging aspect of the physical training was how it was used to break down natural human empathy. Boys were forced to watch and participate in the torture of helots, the enslaved population that served Sparta. They were taught to see these people not as human beings, but as animals deserving of whatever treatment their masters chose to inflict. Young Spartans were required to participate in the Crypteia, a secret police force that hunted and killed helots who showed signs of intelligence, leadership, or rebellion. This wasn't just military training, it was systematic dehumanization. Boys who might have grown up to be compassionate leaders were instead taught that mercy was weakness and that human life had value only insofar as it served the Spartan state. The psychological manipulation extended to how boys were taught to view their own suffering. Pain was redefined as strength. Endurance of abuse was reframed as virtue. The ability to inflict suffering on others was presented as nobility. Boys learned to take pride in their capacity for violence and to view their own trauma as a mark of their superiority over softer peoples. By the time boys reached their teenage years, many had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they no longer remembered what it felt like to experience normal human emotions. They had learned to view themselves and others as tools to be used in service of the state. The capacity for independent thought had been systematically destroyed and replaced with an unquestioning obedience to authority. The few boys who somehow retained their humanity often didn't survive the system. They were weeded out through escalating abuse, dangerous assignments, or mysterious accidents. The agoge was designed to identify and eliminate anyone who might question the system or show mercy to its victims. Those who did survive emerged as something fundamentally different from the children who had entered the system 13 years earlier. They were efficient killers, certainly, but they were also deeply damaged human beings who had learned to find satisfaction in cruelty and meaning in destruction. The Spartan warrior was not born. He was manufactured through a process of systematic abuse that would be recognized today as a form of organized child torture. The true horror of the agoge was not just what it did to individual children, but how it perpetuated itself across generations. Boys who survived the system grew up to become the men who administered it to the next generation. Having been broken themselves, they saw the breaking of others as natural and necessary. The cycle of abuse continued unbroken for centuries, each generation passing on the trauma they had endured to their own children. This was the reality behind Spartan military excellence. It wasn't the product of superior training methods or natural warrior instincts. It was the result of a society that had perfected the art of destroying children's souls and rebuilding them as instruments of the state's will. The famous Spartan discipline was actually the behavioral pattern of deeply traumatized individuals who had learned that conformity meant survival and that deviation meant death. Now that we've followed the children into the agoge's brutal indoctrination, we must examine how this system extended its reach far beyond individual suffering. The Spartan machine didn't simply break one generation. It engineered an entire society around the perpetuation of trauma, creating a culture where the victims of yesterday became the enforcers of tomorrow. The most insidious aspect of the agoge wasn't just its immediate cruelty, but how it transformed survivors into willing participants in their own children's destruction. When those broken boys finally emerged as Spartan warriors, they carried with them not just physical scars, but a profound psychological conditioning that made them view the system's brutality as not only normal, but necessary. These men, having survived years of systematic abuse, developed what we might recognize today as a form of Stockholm syndrome toward their oppressors. The state that had tortured them became the entity they most desperately wanted to serve. The system that had stripped away their humanity became the sacred institution they would defend with their lives. This wasn't accident. It was the agoge's ultimate purpose. When these survivors became fathers, they didn't protect their sons from the horrors they had endured. Instead, they delivered them willingly to the same fate. The trauma had been so thoroughly internalized that they genuinely believed their children needed to suffer as they had suffered. To spare a child from the agoge would have been seen not as mercy, but as the worst form of weakness, a betrayal of everything that made them Spartan. The women of Sparta, too, were woven into this cycle of perpetual trauma. Spartan mothers were conditioned to celebrate their sons' entry into the agoge, to take pride in their children's suffering, and to shame any display of maternal protection. The famous phrase attributed to Spartan mothers, "Come back with your shield or on it," wasn't just about battlefield courage. It was about a mother's willingness to sacrifice her child's life for the state's glory. This created a society where normal human bonds were systematically severed and replaced with loyalty to an abstract ideal. Parents didn't raise children, they bred future soldiers. Communities didn't nurture the young, they processed them through a machine designed to strip away everything that made them human. Love, compassion, and protection became weaknesses to be eliminated rather than virtues to be cultivated. The agoge's true genius lay in how it made this cycle self-perpetuating. Each generation of survivors became convinced that their suffering had been meaningful, that it had forged them into something superior. They couldn't acknowledge that they had been victims without undermining their entire sense of identity. So instead, they became enthusiastic advocates for inflicting the same trauma on the next generation. This dynamic extended beyond individual families to encompass the entire social structure. Spartan society developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies that celebrated the delivery of children to the agoge. Religious festivals honored the wisdom of separating children from their parents. Cultural traditions praised the strength of mothers who showed no emotion when their 7-year-old sons were taken away forever. The Helots, Sparta's enslaved population, served as a constant reminder of what happened to those who couldn't or wouldn't conform to this system. Their brutalization wasn't just economic exploitation, it was a daily demonstration to Spartan children of the fate that awaited anyone who showed weakness or questioned the system. The Crypteia, where young Spartans hunted and killed helots for sport, wasn't just military training. It was a ritual that completed their transformation from human beings into instruments of state violence. Even those who might have harbored doubts about the system found themselves trapped within it. To question the agoge was to question the very foundation of Spartan society. To suggest that children shouldn't be brutalized was to mark oneself as weak, foreign, or corrupted. The social pressure to conform was overwhelming, reinforced by the knowledge that deviation from the norm could result in exile or death. The most tragic aspect of this cycle was how it destroyed the very humanity it claimed to perfect. Spartan warriors, for all their legendary courage and skill, were emotionally crippled men who had never learned to form normal human relationships. They could fight and die for Sparta, but they couldn't love their own children except as future soldiers. They could show loyalty to their comrades, but only within the rigid hierarchy the state had imposed. They could demonstrate courage in battle, but they lived in constant fear of being judged weak or inadequate by the system that had created them. This wasn't strength, it was a profound form of spiritual death. The agoge didn't create superior human beings. It created broken people who had learned to function within a broken system. Their legendary discipline wasn't evidence of virtue, it was evidence of how completely they had surrendered their individual will to the collective machine. The Spartan ideal of the beautiful death in battle wasn't about honor or glory. It was about finding release from a life that had been systematically drained of everything that made existence meaningful. These men didn't seek death in battle because they were brave. They sought it because they had never been allowed to truly live. This cycle of trauma became so deeply embedded in Spartan culture that it outlasted military defeats, political changes, and social upheavals. Long after Sparta's power had waned, long after their military dominance had ended, the basic structure of the agoge persisted. The society had become addicted to its own brutality, unable to imagine any other way of existing. Modern observers often struggle to understand how such a system could have been sustained for centuries. The answer lies in recognizing that the agoge wasn't just a military training program, it was a comprehensive system for manufacturing complicity in collective trauma. Every survivor became an advocate, every victim became a victimizer, every broken child grew up to break the next generation. This is perhaps the most chilling lesson of the Spartan agoge. How quickly and completely a society can normalize the systematic destruction of its own children when that destruction is wrapped in noble language and sacred tradition. The Spartans didn't see themselves as child abusers. They saw themselves as the creators of heroes. They didn't recognize their society as a machine for manufacturing trauma. They believed it was a forge for creating perfection. The real tragedy of Sparta wasn't that it fell to foreign enemies or internal decay. The real tragedy was that it succeeded so completely in its goal of transforming human beings into something else entirely, something that could no longer recognize its own humanity, let alone protect the humanity of others. The agoge didn't just break individual children, it broke the very concept of childhood itself, replacing it with a mechanical process for creating soldiers who had never been allowed to be human. This was the ultimate victory of the Spartan system, not just the production of fearsome warriors, but the creation of a society that had forgotten what it meant to be anything else. The Spartan agoge wasn't just about physical brutality and emotional conditioning. It was also a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation designed to create perfect instruments of state control. By the time boys reached their teenage years, the program had already stripped away their individual identities, but now came the most insidious phase, teaching them to police themselves and each other. The older boys, those who had survived the initial years of conditioning, became the enforcers of the system. They weren't just victims anymore. They were active participants in perpetuating the cycle of abuse. The agoge created a hierarchy where survival meant becoming complicit in the suffering of others. Boys who showed mercy were punished. Those who reported weakness in their peers were rewarded. The system didn't just break children, it turned them into willing collaborators in their own dehumanization. This wasn't accidental. The Spartans understood something that modern totalitarian regimes would later rediscover. The most effective control comes not from external force, but from internal compliance. When victims become perpetrators, when the oppressed become oppressors, the system becomes self-sustaining. Every boy who graduated from the agoge carried within him not just the scars of his own suffering, but the psychological machinery to inflict that same suffering on the next generation. The genius of this approach was its completeness. It didn't just create soldiers who would follow orders. It created men who couldn't conceive of any other way of living. The agoge produced individuals so thoroughly conditioned that they experienced genuine distress when separated from the system that had tortured them. They had been programmed to equate suffering with virtue, brutality with strength, and absolute obedience with honor. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this psychological conditioning was how it extended beyond the barracks. These broken men returned to Spartan society as fathers, teachers, and leaders, carrying with them the twisted values of the agoge. They raised their own sons with the same casual cruelty they had experienced, genuinely believing they were preparing them for greatness. The cycle was complete. The victims had become the victimizers, and the system continued to feed on fresh generations of children. This psychological dimension of the agoge reveals why Spartan society was so remarkably stable for centuries, despite being built on fundamentally inhuman principles. It wasn't held together by force alone, but by the deeper horror of collective Stockholm syndrome on a civilizational scale. The Spartans had created a culture where everyone was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, where questioning the system meant questioning one's entire identity and purpose. The boys who entered the agoge as innocent children emerged as adults who had been systematically stripped of their capacity for independent moral reasoning. They had been taught that their individual thoughts, feelings, and desires were not just unimportant, they were actively dangerous to the state. The perfect Spartan was one who had internalized the system so completely that external control was no longer necessary. He had become his own jailer, his own torturer, his own executioner of human compassion. This psychological architecture explains why so few Spartans ever rebelled against their system, despite its obvious cruelties. To reject the agoge would have meant rejecting everything they understood about themselves, their purpose, and their place in the world. The system had become so deeply embedded in their psychological structure that escape wasn't just practically difficult, it was psychologically impossible. By the time you turn 18, your bones have likely stopped growing. Your height is set, your voice has changed, and in most ways, your physical development is complete. But if you were a Spartan boy in ancient Greece, turning 18 wasn't graduation from childhood. It was barely the halfway point of a brutal 13-year program designed to strip away everything that made you human and rebuild you as something else entirely. Something harder, something colder, something that could kill without hesitation and die without complaint. Welcome to the agoge, the most ruthless educational system ever devised. A machine that took 7-year-old children and through systematic starvation, violence, and psychological warfare, transformed them into the most feared warriors in the ancient world. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The agoge wasn't just military training. It was the systematic destruction of childhood itself, a deliberate assault on empathy, individuality, and basic human compassion. Tonight, we're diving deep into the dark heart of Spartan society to understand how a civilization convinced itself that breaking children was the path to greatness. This isn't a story about heroic warriors or noble sacrifice. This is a story about what happens when a society decides that cruelty is a virtue and that suffering builds character. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into one of history's most chilling experiments in human conditioning. The agoge began with abandonment, but not the kind you might expect. This wasn't parents leaving children on doorsteps or in forests. This was the state systematically severing the bonds between mother and child, not through neglect, but through policy. At age 7, every Spartan boy was taken from his family and handed over to the state. No exceptions, no appeals, no mercy. Imagine being 7 years old. In our world, you're still losing baby teeth, still afraid of the dark, still needing comfort when you scrape your knee. But in Sparta, 7 meant the end of everything familiar. Your mother's voice, your father's protection, your warm bed, your favorite toy, all of it vanished in a single day. You were assigned to a pack of boys your age, given a single cloak to last you year round, and told that from now on, your survival depended entirely on how well you could endure pain. The psychological impact was immediate and intentional. The agoge understood something that modern child psychologists would later confirm. The bonds between parent and child are the foundation of emotional development. Sever those bonds early enough, and you can reshape a child's entire emotional architecture. The boys weren't just separated from their families, they were taught to forget them. Homesickness was weakness. Missing your mother was shameful. Crying was punishable. But the genius of the system wasn't just in taking children away from their families. It was in replacing family bonds with something else entirely: loyalty to the state and dependence on your pack. The boys were organized into herds, small groups that ate together, slept together, and suffered together. Your herd became your new family, but it was a family built on competition rather than love, on survival rather than nurturing. This wasn't accidental. The Spartans had observed that children who maintained emotional connections to their birth families were less willing to die for the state, so they systematically destroyed those connections, not through violence, but through replacement. They gave the boys just enough companionship to survive, but never enough warmth to flourish. They created emotional dependency without emotional security, loyalty without love. The result was a generation of children who learned before they even understood what they were learning that attachment was dangerous, that vulnerability was fatal, and that the only safety lay in becoming hard enough that nothing could break you. They didn't just lose their families, they lost their capacity to believe in the very concept of unconditional love. Once the emotional bonds were severed, the agoge moved to the next phase, teaching children that their bodies were not their own. This wasn't about building physical strength or endurance. This was about breaking the fundamental human assumption that your body belongs to you, that you have the right to comfort, safety, and basic care. The boys were given one cloak, not one for winter and one for summer. One, period. They slept outdoors year-round, regardless of weather. In the brutal Greek winters, when temperatures dropped below freezing, these children huddled together under thin wool, their breath forming clouds, their fingers and toes going numb. Many developed frostbite, some lost digits. The strong ones learned to steal body heat from the weak ones. The weak ones learned to accept that their suffering didn't matter. Food was equally controlled and equally inadequate. The boys were fed just enough to keep them functional, but never enough to satisfy their hunger. Chronic malnutrition became their baseline. They learned to think about food constantly, to dream about it, to obsess over every crumb. But they also learned that expressing hunger was forbidden, that asking for more was weakness, that their physical needs were secondary to their training. The genius of this deprivation was that it taught multiple lessons simultaneously. First, it conditioned the boys to accept that their comfort was irrelevant. Second, it forced them to become resourceful, in ways that would serve them in warfare. And third, it created a psychological association between suffering and strength. The boys who endured the cold without complaint, who ignored their hunger without breaking, were praised as examples. Those who faltered were made examples of a different kind. But perhaps most importantly, the constant physical discomfort served as a form of psychological conditioning. When your body is always cold, always hungry, always uncomfortable, you stop expecting relief. You stop believing that comfort is possible. You internalize the idea that suffering is the natural state of existence, and that anyone who expects otherwise is weak, naive, or both. The boys learned to take pride in their ability to endure what would break others. They competed to see who could go longest without showing discomfort, who could sleep in the coldest spot, who could ignore injuries that would send normal children crying for help. They were being taught that their bodies were tools to be used and discarded, not vessels of human experience to be cherished and protected. Physical deprivation was just the beginning. The agoge's true masterpiece was its systematic assault on individual identity. In most societies, childhood is when you discover who you are, what you like, what makes you unique. The agoge viewed individuality as a threat to unit cohesion and did everything in its power to crush it before it could take root. The boys were stripped of their names and given numbers. They wore identical clothing, ate identical food, and followed identical schedules. Any attempt to stand out, to express personal preferences, or to develop individual interests was met with swift correction. There was no art for art's sake, no music for pleasure, no stories for wonder. Everything was functional, martial, collective. But the real genius lay in how they replaced individual identity with group identity. The boys weren't just discouraged from being individuals. They were taught that individuality was selfish, dangerous, and ultimately futile. Your personal desires meant nothing. Your individual dreams were irrelevant. Your private thoughts were suspect. What mattered was the group, the state, the collective will of Sparta. This wasn't achieved through lecture or philosophy. It was achieved through daily practice. When one boy failed, the entire herd was punished. When one boy succeeded, the entire herd was rewarded. The boys learned that their individual actions had collective consequences and that their personal welfare was inseparable from their group's performance. Over time, this created a psychological phenomenon that modern researchers would recognize as ego dissolution. The boys stopped thinking of themselves as separate entities with distinct needs and desires. They began to think of themselves as components in a larger organism, cells in a body whose health mattered more than any individual cell's survival. The most chilling aspect of this process was how thoroughly it worked. Boys who entered the agoge with distinct personalities, preferences, and quirks emerged as virtually indistinguishable units. They thought alike, spoke alike, and reacted alike. They had become interchangeable parts in the Spartan war machine, and they took pride in their uniformity. They weren't just trained soldiers, they were mass-produced personalities, each one calibrated to serve the state's needs without question or hesitation. The agoge had succeeded in creating something that had never existed before: human beings who had been deliberately stripped of their humanity and rebuilt as pure instruments of collective will. Violence in the agoge wasn't random or chaotic. It was methodical, purposeful, and carefully calibrated to achieve specific psychological effects. The boys weren't just beaten, they were beaten in ways designed to teach them that violence was normal, that pain was meaningless, and that their survival depended on their ability to inflict suffering on others without hesitation or remorse. The training began with simple brutality. Boys were forced to fight each other barehanded until one was unconscious or unable to continue. These weren't sparring matches or competitive contests. They were savage beatings designed to teach the participants that mercy was weakness and that holding back was tantamount to treason. The instructors watched carefully, noting which boys showed reluctance to hurt their opponents and which ones displayed what they called proper aggression. Those who hesitated to cause pain were singled out for special attention. They were beaten more severely, starved more completely, and humiliated more thoroughly until they learned to overcome their natural empathy. The message was clear. Your instinct to avoid harming others is a flaw that must be corrected. Your reluctance to cause suffering is a weakness that makes you a liability to your unit. But the agoge went beyond simply teaching boys to tolerate violence. It taught them to crave it. Boys who showed exceptional brutality were rewarded with better food, warmer sleeping spots, and public recognition. They learned that causing pain brought pleasure, that dominance brought security, and that the ability to hurt others was the most valuable skill they could develop. The psychological conditioning was reinforced through ritualized violence that served no practical purpose other than to normalize cruelty. Boys were forced to watch as captured enemies were tortured and killed. They were required to participate in the execution of helots, the enslaved population that served Spartan society. They learned to see suffering not as something to be prevented, but as something to be administered efficiently and without emotion. Perhaps most disturbing was how the agoge taught boys to turn violence inward when outward targets weren't available. Self-harm became a form of training, a way to demonstrate your commitment to hardness. Boys competed to see who could endure the most pain without crying out, who could inflict the most damage on themselves without flinching, who could best prove that they had transcended normal human responses to injury and trauma. The result was a generation of young men who had been systematically desensitized to suffering, both their own and others. They had learned to see violence not as a last resort or a necessary evil, but as the primary tool for solving problems and expressing strength. They didn't just tolerate brutality. They had been conditioned to see it as beautiful, necessary, and worthy of celebration. One of the agoge's most insidious features was its deliberate cultivation of a specific type of competition, zero-sum thinking, where one person's success required another's failure. This wasn't healthy rivalry or motivation to excel. This was systematic training in cruelty disguised as character building. The boys were constantly ranked against each other in every conceivable metric. Who could endure cold the longest? Who could go without food the most gracefully? Who showed the least emotion when beaten? Who demonstrated the most ruthlessness when given the opportunity to dominate others? These weren't occasional tests. They were the daily fabric of existence. Every moment was an opportunity to prove your superiority or reveal your weakness. But the genius of the system lay in its scarcity economics. There was never enough of anything: food, warmth, comfort, approval to go around. This artificial scarcity forced the boys into constant competition with each other for basic necessities. Cooperation became literally impossible because helping another boy meant depriving yourself, and self deprivation was seen as evidence of weakness. The boys learned to see their peers not as friends or brothers, but as obstacles to their own survival. They developed a hyper-vigilant awareness of others' weaknesses and a calculating approach to exploiting those weaknesses when advantageous. Empathy became not just useless, but actively dangerous, because caring about others' suffering would handicap your ability to compete effectively. The instructors carefully orchestrated situations designed to force moral choices that had no good outcomes. Boys were given the opportunity to earn extra food by reporting on their peers' violations of rules. They were offered better treatment in exchange for participating in the punishment of weaker boys. They were presented with scenarios where showing mercy would result in collective punishment for their entire herd. Over time, these impossible choices wore down the boys' moral resistance. They learned that ethical behavior was a luxury they couldn't afford, that loyalty to individuals was less important than loyalty to the system, and that survival required a willingness to sacrifice others when necessary. They developed what modern psychologists would recognize as moral injury, the deep psychological wound that comes from being forced to violate your own ethical standards repeatedly until you stop having ethical standards at all. The most chilling aspect of this competitive conditioning was how it prepared the boys for their adult roles. As Spartan warriors, they would need to see enemy soldiers not as human beings with families and dreams, but as obstacles to be eliminated efficiently. The agoge had taught them to practice this dehumanization on each other first, ensuring that by the time they faced real enemies, the psychological barriers to killing had long since been worn away. Human beings are naturally social creatures with deep psychological needs for belonging, acceptance, and emotional connection. The agoge recognized these needs and weaponized them, using the boys' desperate hunger for approval as a tool to reshape their moral architecture. But the approval they offered came with conditions that systematically corrupted everything healthy about human social bonding. The boys learned that acceptance was conditional on their willingness to embrace increasingly extreme behaviors. Kindness was met with rejection. Gentleness was punished with isolation. Empathy was treated as evidence of unreliability. The only way to earn approval from instructors and peers was to demonstrate your commitment to hardness, your willingness to cause and endure pain, and your complete subordination of individual conscience to collective will. This created a psychological trap that modern researchers would recognize as trauma bonding. The boys formed intense emotional connections with the very system that was destroying them. They learned to crave approval from the people who were systematically breaking them down, to find identity in their shared suffering, and to take pride in their ability to endure what would break normal human beings. The instructors were careful to provide just enough positive reinforcement to keep the boys psychologically invested in the system. A word of praise for exceptional brutality, a slightly larger food ration for perfect obedience, a moment of recognition for outstanding endurance. These tiny rewards became enormously powerful because they were the only sources of positive attention available in an otherwise relentlessly harsh environment. But perhaps most insidiously, the boys learned to police each other. They became so invested in earning approval that they began to monitor their peers for signs of weakness or deviation from acceptable behavior. They learned to report violations, to participate enthusiastically in collective punishments, and to take pride in their ability to spot and eliminate signs of softness in their comrades. This peer policing served multiple functions. It ensured that the conditioning continued even when instructors weren't present. It prevented the formation of genuine friendships that might compete with loyalty to the state. And it taught the boys to internalize the agoge's values so completely that they became willing enforcers of their own oppression. The result was a social environment where authentic human connection became impossible. The boys were surrounded by peers, but remained fundamentally isolated because every relationship was transactional, competitive, and potentially dangerous. They learned to present facades of toughness while hiding any trace of vulnerability, to perform loyalty while trusting no one completely, and to seek approval through behaviors that violated their deepest human instincts. By adolescence, the boys had become psychological orphans, surrounded by people but connected to none, desperate for acceptance, but trained to earn it through cruelty, hungry for belonging, but only able to find it through the systematic destruction of everything that might have made them genuinely worthy of love. By the early 1500s, the agoge had weathered centuries of evolution, yet its core mission remained brutally unchanged: to forge boys into instruments of state power through systematic brutalization. As Sparta entered its final phase, the system that had once produced legendary warriors now operated more as a ritualistic engine of control, preserving the facade of ancient glory while serving the interests of those who wielded power over a diminished city-state. The boys who entered this late-stage agoge faced an institution that had become, if anything, more psychologically sophisticated in its methods of dehumanization. The physical hardships remained: the deliberate starvation, the exposure to elements, the ritualized beatings. But centuries of refinement had created a system that understood precisely how to break a child's will while maintaining the illusion that this breaking was strength. What made this final incarnation of the agoge particularly insidious was how it had perfected the art of making victims complicit in their own destruction. Boys learned not just to endure brutality, but to celebrate it as virtue. They competed for the privilege of suffering more, of proving their worthiness through greater submission to the system's demands. The agoge had evolved beyond simple conditioning. It had become a master class in manufacturing consent for one's own dehumanization. The ceremonies surrounding graduation had grown more elaborate, more theatrical. Boys who survived the full program were inducted not just as warriors, but as guardians of tradition, keepers of Spartan virtue. They were told they were the inheritors of Leonidas, the spiritual descendants of heroes. What they actually inherited was a legacy of normalized violence, emotional numbness, and the unshakable belief that their worth as human beings was contingent upon their usefulness to power. This final generation of agoge graduates would go on to marry, to father children, to participate in civic life. But they carried within them the psychological architecture of their training: the reflexive deference to authority, the inability to form deep emotional bonds, the tendency to view human relationships through the lens of dominance and submission. They had been programmed to perpetuate the very system that had destroyed their capacity for genuine human connection. Perhaps most tragically, these men genuinely believed they were preserving something noble. They spoke of honor, of duty, of the sacred traditions of their ancestors. They could not see that what they were actually preserving was a machine designed to consume children and produce compliant adults. The agoge had succeeded in its ultimate goal, creating guardians who would protect the system not despite its cruelty, but because they had been taught to mistake that cruelty for strength. The final irony of the Spartan agoge was that it achieved its own destruction through success. By producing generations of men incapable of adaptation, innovation, or genuine leadership, it ensured that Sparta would become increasingly irrelevant in a changing world. The system that claimed to forge the strongest warriors had actually created the most brittle society, one that could maintain its internal brutality, but could not evolve, could not grow, could not ultimately survive. When the agoge finally ended, it left behind more than ruins and memories. It left a template, a blueprint for how societies could use the systematic abuse of children to maintain power structures. The methods would evolve, the justifications would change, but the fundamental logic would persist. Take children at their most vulnerable, break their natural human instincts, and rebuild them as instruments of the state's will. The boys of the agoge were not just victims of an ancient system. They were proof of humanity's capacity to normalize the unthinkable, to transform cruelty into culture, and to mistake the destruction of childhood for the creation of strength. Their story serves as a warning that resonates across centuries, that any society willing to sacrifice its children's humanity in service of abstract ideals has already lost the very thing it claims to be protecting. Part 10, the breaking point, when victims become enforcers. By now, you've witnessed the systematic dismantling of childhood, the methodical stripping away of everything that makes a child human. You've seen 7-year-old boys torn from their mothers, starved into compliance, beaten into submission, and molded into emotionless instruments of state power. But here's where the agoge reveals its most insidious genius. The moment when the victims themselves become willing participants in their own destruction, and eventually the destroyers of the next generation. This is the psychological checkmate of Spartan conditioning. The point where broken children don't just accept their suffering, they begin to inflict it on others, where the tortured become the torturers, where the system doesn't need external enforcers because it has created internal ones, programmed from birth to perpetuate the cycle of brutality that shaped them. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual erosion of natural human empathy replaced by something far more dangerous. The belief that cruelty is kindness, that breaking others is building them, that inflicting pain is an act of love. The Spartan system understood something terrifying about human psychology. If you can convince someone that their suffering had meaning, they'll gladly inflict that same suffering on others. Think about it. After years of being told that every beating, every humiliation, every moment of agony was necessary to forge them into superior beings, these boys didn't just survive the system, they embraced it. They internalized the narrative that their torment had been a gift, that their tormentors had been their saviors. The cognitive dissonance of admitting they had been brutalized for nothing was too devastating to accept. So instead, They convinced themselves it had all been necessary, even noble. This is how the agoge created its own perpetual motion machine of abuse. Each generation of graduates became the administrators of the next generation's torture. The 20-year-old who had been starved as a child now withheld food from 7-year-olds, telling himself he was teaching them resilience. The man who had been beaten into emotional numbness now struck children with calculated precision, believing he was forging their character. But here's the truly chilling part. They weren't lying to the children. They were lying to themselves. These weren't sadistic monsters who enjoyed inflicting pain. These were broken men who had been so thoroughly programmed that they genuinely believed cruelty was compassion. They looked at a terrified 7-year-old and saw themselves at that age. And instead of feeling protective empathy, they felt obligation. The obligation to save this child through the same methods that had saved them. The system had weaponized their trauma, turning their deepest wounds into tools of oppression. Every moment of suffering they had endured became justification for the suffering they would inflict. They had been conditioned to see kindness as weakness, gentleness as corruption, mercy as betrayal of their sacred duty. The very capacity for natural human compassion had been systematically rewired into its opposite. Watch how this played out in the daily operations of the agoge. The older boys, the ones who had survived the worst of it, became the most enthusiastic enforcers. They competed with each other to see who could be most ruthlessly effective at breaking the younger ones. Not because they were naturally cruel, but because they had been taught that effectiveness in creating suffering was the highest form of virtue. They would devise increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological torture, telling themselves they were being creative educators. They would withhold comfort from homesick children, convincing themselves they were building independence. They would orchestrate humiliation rituals, believing they were teaching humility. Every act of cruelty was dressed up in the language of character development. And the most insidious part? The children being tortured could see their future selves in these older boys. They learned that survival meant not just enduring the abuse, but eventually becoming enthusiastic participants in it. The message was clear. The only way to escape being a victim was to become a victimizer. The only way to stop being broken was to start breaking others. This created a perverse incentive structure where the most damaged individuals rose to positions of authority within the system. The boys who had been most thoroughly broken, who had most completely surrendered their natural empathy, became the most trusted administrators because they could be counted on never to show mercy, never to question the methods, never to remember what it felt like to be human. The system didn't just create soldiers, it created a self-replicating hierarchy of trauma. Each level of survivors became the oppressors of the level below them, all the way down to the newest arrivals. It was psychological pyramid scheme where the currency was suffering, and the only way to advance was to invest that suffering in others. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this transformation was how it infected their understanding of love itself. These men had been taught that love was demonstrated through controlled cruelty, that caring for someone meant being willing to hurt them for their own good, that the deepest expression of affection was the willingness to inflict necessary pain. So when they became fathers, when they looked at their own 7-year-old sons, they felt love, real, genuine paternal love. And because their understanding of love had been so thoroughly corrupted that love expressed itself as a willingness to hand their children over to the same system that had destroyed them, they convinced themselves that sending their boys to the agoge was the greatest gift they could give, the ultimate act of paternal devotion. The children, in their final moments of innocence, would look up at their fathers with trust and confusion. Why was Daddy doing this? Why was the person who was supposed to protect them delivering them to their destroyers? And the fathers, with tears in their eyes and steel in their hearts, would tell themselves they were being strong, they were being good Spartans, they were being loving parents. This is how the agoge achieved its most complete victory. It didn't just break individuals, it broke the transmission of human values from one generation to the next. It severed the natural bonds between parent and child, replacing them with loyalty to the state. It transformed the most fundamental human relationship, the protective love of parent for child, into another mechanism of control. The graduates of the agoge became walking contradictions, men who had been destroyed in the name of strength, who had been dehumanized in the name of virtue, who had been broken in the name of building. And they spent the rest of their lives trying to resolve that contradiction, not by questioning the system, but by proving its worth through their willingness to inflict it on others. They became the perfect products of their conditioning, individuals so thoroughly programmed that they could no longer distinguish between love and abuse, between protection and destruction, between salvation and damnation. They were living proof that the human spirit, no matter how resilient, could be not just broken, but inverted, turned against itself and against every natural instinct of care and protection. This wasn't just child abuse. This was the systematic creation of child abusers. This wasn't just trauma. This was the weaponization of trauma into a tool of perpetual oppression. The agoge didn't just destroy childhoods, it destroyed the very concept of childhood protection, replacing it with a cultural mandate to sacrifice children on the altar of state power. And the most haunting part? These men believed, with absolute sincerity, that they were the heroes of their own story. They had been saved by the system, and now they were saving others. They were not monsters. In their own minds, they were servants of a higher purpose, disciples of a sacred duty, guardians of an ancient wisdom. They had become the perfect enforcers of their own oppression, and they would die believing they had lived lives of meaning and honor. The agoge had achieved its ultimate goal. It had created a society where the victims policed themselves, where the oppressed became the oppressors, where the broken spent their lives breaking others in an endless cycle of sanctified cruelty. This was the true genius of Spartan conditioning, not just to create soldiers, but to create a self-perpetuating system of human destruction that would outlast any individual, any generation, in an external threat. It had built its own immortality into the very souls of its victims, ensuring that the cycle would continue long after the original architects were dust. Now that the students have finally returned to their dormitories and settled into their straw mattresses after another day of brutal training, we come to perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Spartan system, the psychological transformation that occurred in those dark barracks during the long winter nights. Because while the physical brutality of the agoge was designed to forge warriors, the mental conditioning was designed to create something far more disturbing, human beings who no longer questioned their own suffering or the suffering they inflicted on others. You see, by this point in their training, these boys weren't just enduring abuse, they were beginning to perpetuate it. The older students, now hardened by years of systematic cruelty, became the primary enforcers of discipline among the younger boys. They had learned to find purpose in their pain by inflicting it on those below them. It was a brilliant and horrific cycle, each generation of victims becoming the next generation of tormentors, ensuring that the system would sustain itself without requiring constant oversight from adult supervisors. The most chilling aspect of this transformation was how naturally it occurred. Boys who had once wept in terror at their first beatings now administered similar punishments with cold efficiency. They had internalized the logic of their oppressors so completely that they genuinely believed they were helping their younger peers by subjecting them to the same brutalities they had endured. This wasn't rebellion or revenge. It was religious devotion to a system that had convinced them their suffering was sacred. The psychological mechanisms at work here are deeply disturbing. Through a process that modern psychologists would recognize as learned helplessness combined with identification with the aggressor, these boys developed what we might call institutional Stockholm Syndrome. They didn't just accept their abuse, they came to see it as evidence of their own value and worth. The more they suffered, the more special they believed themselves to be. The more they were broken down, the more they identified with the strength they imagined they were building. This mental conditioning extended far beyond mere physical endurance. The boys were taught to view emotions like compassion, empathy, and mercy as weaknesses to be purged from their character. They learned to suppress not just expressions of pain, but the very capacity to recognize pain as unacceptable. When they saw a younger boy being beaten, they felt nothing. Or worse, they felt pride in the system that had made them strong enough to watch without flinching. The winter months were particularly crucial for this psychological transformation. Confined together in cramped quarters, subjected to even harsher conditions than usual, the boys had nowhere to escape from each other or from the constant reinforcement of Spartan values. They told stories of famous warriors who had died gloriously in battle. They competed to see who could endure the most pain without crying out. They created elaborate hierarchies based on who had been punished most severely and had taken it best. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how they learned to police each other's thoughts and feelings. Boys who showed too much sympathy for a beaten comrade were themselves marked for additional punishment. Those who questioned the necessity of particularly brutal training exercises were isolated and subjected to psychological torture until they not only complied but expressed gratitude for the correction. The system taught them that their own minds were the enemy, that any thought or feeling that contradicted Spartan doctrine was a form of treason against their own potential greatness. This psychological conditioning created boys who were no longer fully human in any recognizable sense. They had been systematically stripped of the capacity for independent moral reasoning, for emotional connection, for the basic human ability to recognize suffering as wrong. They had become living weapons, but weapons that believed their purpose was holy and their sacrifices meaningful. And here's the truly horrific part. It worked. These psychologically shattered boys did indeed become some of the most effective soldiers in the ancient world. Their inability to feel normal human emotions, like fear, pity, or moral uncertainty, made them incredibly dangerous in combat. They fought with the mechanical precision of machines and the fanatical devotion of religious zealots. They had been so thoroughly convinced that their worth as human beings depended entirely on their service to Sparta that they genuinely preferred death to anything that might be construed as failure or cowardice. The Spartan system had achieved something that even the most sophisticated modern propaganda could barely dream of: the complete psychological transformation of human beings into instruments of state power who genuinely believed their dehumanization was the highest form of human achievement. These boys didn't just serve Sparta, they had become Sparta, walking embodiments of a society that valued strength above humanity and conformity above individual worth. And as they lay in their barracks on those cold winter nights, no longer capable of the tears they might once have shed, they dreamed not of escape or of normal lives, but of the glorious deaths that would finally prove their worth to the only God they had left, the Spartan state that had created them by destroying everything they might have been. The trauma was total, the system was absolute, and by the time the survivors graduated from the agoge, they were no longer human beings capable of independent thought or genuine emotion. They were weapons, perfectly crafted for one purpose: to serve Sparta without question, without hesitation, and without mercy. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. The graduates didn't see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as superior. They had internalized every lesson, every beating, every humiliation, and transformed it into pride. The system had convinced them that their suffering was strength, that their obedience was honor, that their inability to form genuine human connections was actually virtue. They became the enforcers of their own trauma. The boys who had once cowered under the whips now wielded those same whips against the next generation. They perpetuated the cycle not because they were forced to, but because they genuinely believed it was right. The agoge had succeeded in its most insidious goal, making its victims complicit in their own destruction. And this is where the true horror lies. Sparta didn't just break these boys, it convinced them that being broken was what made them whole. It taught them that love was weakness, that compassion was failure, that the only relationships worth having were those built on dominance and submission. They emerged from the agoge as emotional zombies, walking corpses who had traded their humanity for the illusion of strength. The graduates returned to their families, but they were strangers. They could no longer connect with their mothers, their sisters, their wives. They had been conditioned to see emotional vulnerability as a character flaw, genuine affection as a dangerous distraction. They raised their own sons with the same cold brutality they had experienced, passing down generations of trauma disguised as tradition. This wasn't just education. This was systematic psychological warfare waged against children by the state. And the most terrifying part, it worked. These broken men went on to become the backbone of one of history's most feared military machines. They conquered territories, enslaved populations, and spread their ideology of human disposability across the ancient world. But the real victory of the Spartan system wasn't military, it was ideological. Long after Sparta itself crumbled into irrelevance, the myth of Spartan strength persisted. The idea that suffering builds character, that emotion is weakness, that true strength comes from the ability to endure pain without complaint, became embedded in cultures around the world. Even today, we romanticize this brutality. We speak admiringly of Spartan discipline and tough love. We tell ourselves that children need to be toughened up, that showing vulnerability is shameful, that the ability to inflict and endure cruelty is somehow noble. The ghost of the agoge still haunts our schools, our military academies, our sports programs, anywhere we decide that breaking people down is the path to building them up. The boys who entered the agoge at 7 years old had their capacity for genuine human connection systematically destroyed. They were taught that empathy was a liability, that trust was dangerous, that the only relationships worth having were those built on power and control. They became adults who could function in groups but could never truly belong to them, who could command respect but could never earn love, who could survive anything except the prospect of being truly known by another human being. And perhaps most tragically, they convinced themselves that this emotional wasteland was actually paradise. They believed that their inability to feel was enlightenment, that their isolation was independence, that their trauma was triumph. The system had successfully rewritten their understanding of what it meant to be human, convincing them that humanity itself was the enemy. The Spartan childhood wasn't just harsh, it was a deliberate campaign to murder the souls of children while leaving their bodies intact. It was a system designed to produce soldiers who would never question, never hesitate, never feel the weight of the lives they took or the communities they destroyed, and it succeeded beyond its creators' wildest dreams, producing generations of men who wore their emotional scars like badges of honor and passed their trauma down like family heirlooms. So no, you wouldn't survive a Spartan childhood, not because you're weak, but because survival in Sparta required becoming something that wasn't really alive anymore. It required trading your humanity for the hollow promise of strength, your capacity for love for the cold comfort of control, your soul for the illusion of superiority. The most chilling aspect of the Spartan system wasn't just its cruelty, it was how effectively it convinced its victims that their suffering was noble. Every broken bone, every sleepless night, every moment of starvation was reframed as a badge of honor. The boys who survived the agoge didn't just endure trauma, they were taught to worship it. They learned to see their scars not as evidence of abuse, but as proof of their superiority over the rest of humanity. This psychological manipulation ran so deep that even modern discussions of Sparta often fall into the same trap. We talk about Spartan discipline, Spartan strength, Spartan warrior culture, as if these were admirable qualities rather than the products of systematic child abuse. We've been conditioned by centuries of military romanticism to see the end result, the fearless warrior, without truly confronting the human cost of creating such a person. But here's what those romanticized accounts never tell you. The Spartan warriors weren't fearless because they were brave. They were fearless because their capacity for normal human emotion had been systematically destroyed. Fear, after all, is often a healthy response that keeps us alive and helps us make rational decisions. A person without fear isn't necessarily courageous. They might simply be psychologically damaged. The evidence for this emotional devastation is everywhere in Spartan society if you know where to look. Spartan men struggled with basic human relationships. their entire lives. They were legally required to marry and produce children, but they were so emotionally stunted that they often couldn't maintain normal marriages. Many Spartan wives complained about their husband's inability to connect emotionally or show affection. The very skills that made them effective warriors, emotional suppression, inability to form deep bonds, comfort with violence, made them failures as husbands and fathers. Even their famous military effectiveness came with severe limitations. Spartans were indeed formidable in traditional hoplite warfare, but they struggled to adapt to new tactics or situations that required creativity and independent thinking. Their rigid conditioning made them predictable. Enemies who understood their psychology could manipulate them, using their own programming against them. The very inflexibility that made them seem invincible also made them vulnerable to anyone clever enough to exploit their psychological conditioning. Consider what happened to individual Spartans when they were separated from their rigid system. Away from the constant reinforcement of their conditioning, many exhibited signs of what we would now recognize as severe psychological disorders. They had panic attacks, became violent and unpredictable, or simply shut down entirely. They were like machines that could only function within very specific parameters. Remove them from those parameters, and they broke down completely. The women of Sparta, while not subjected to the agoge, faced their own forms of systematic dehumanization. They were valued primarily for their ability to produce strong warrior sons. Their worth was measured by their fertility and their willingness to sacrifice their children to the state. Mothers were praised for sending their sons to die in battle and condemned if they showed too much grief over their losses. The famous Spartan saying, "Come back with your shield or on it," wasn't just about military honor. It was about a mother's willingness to prioritize state propaganda over maternal love. These women were trapped in their own psychological prison. They had to suppress their natural protective instincts toward their children, knowing that showing too much affection would be seen as weakness. They were forced to participate in the abandonment of their own infants, pretending to agree with a system that treated their babies as disposable. The psychological toll of this forced complicity was immense, but it was necessary for the system to function. The state needed mothers who would willingly feed their children into the machine of war. The economic structure of Sparta also reveals the true cost of their military obsession. While Spartan warriors were training and fighting, the actual work of society was done by helots, enslaved people who were terrorized into submission. The Spartans were so dependent on this slave labor that they lived in constant fear of revolt. They had to regularly murder helots just to keep them intimidated. This wasn't strength, it was a society so dysfunctional that it could only maintain itself through constant violence and terror. The helots themselves were subjected to psychological warfare designed to break their spirits. Young Spartans were encouraged to hunt and kill helots as part of their training, treating human beings like animals. This served multiple purposes. It desensitized the warriors to killing, it terrorized the helot population, and it reinforced the dehumanization that was central to Spartan ideology. But it also meant that Spartan society was built on a foundation of genocide and psychological torture. What's particularly disturbing is how this system of abuse was self-perpetuating. The boys who survived the agoge weren't just victims, they became enthusiastic enforcers of the same system that had destroyed their own childhoods. They couldn't allow themselves to see the abuse as abuse, because that would mean confronting the reality of what had been done to them. Instead, they convinced themselves that they were strong, that they were superior, that their suffering had meaning. This is a classic pattern in cycles of abuse. The victim becomes the perpetrator, not out of malice, but out of psychological necessity. To admit that the system was wrong would mean admitting that their own suffering was meaningless, that they had been broken for nothing. It was easier to believe that they were heroes than to face the truth about what they had become. The religious and cultural mythology of Sparta reinforced this psychological manipulation. The Spartans didn't just claim to be following orders, they claimed to be following divine will. Their kings were supposedly descended from gods. Their laws were supposedly given by the gods. This wasn't just political propaganda. It was a sophisticated system of psychological control that made questioning the system equivalent to questioning divine authority. Boys in the agoge weren't just told they were serving their city, they were told they were serving the gods themselves. Their suffering wasn't just for military effectiveness, it was for spiritual purification. This religious dimension made the abuse even more psychologically devastating because it attacked not just the body and mind, but the soul. It made resistance feel like sacrilege. The long-term consequences of this system extended far beyond individual psychology. Spartan society as a whole became increasingly rigid and unable to adapt to changing circumstances. While other Greek city-states were developing philosophy, art, literature, and science, Sparta remained locked in its narrow obsession with military conquest. They produced no great thinkers, no beautiful art, no lasting contributions to human knowledge or culture. Their entire civilization was dedicated to the production of human weapons. This cultural sterility wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of a system that crushed creativity, curiosity, and independent thought. You can't raise children to be unquestioning automatons and then expect them to become innovative thinkers. You can't suppress emotional development and then expect rich cultural expression. The Spartans chose military effectiveness over human flourishing, and the result was a society that was spiritually dead even at its peak. The decline of Sparta was as inevitable as it was tragic. A society built on such a narrow foundation couldn't adapt when the world around it changed. As warfare evolved, as political structures shifted, as economic systems became more complex, Sparta found itself increasingly irrelevant. Their warriors were still physically formidable, but they were psychologically incapable of understanding or adapting to new realities. More fundamentally, the Spartan system contained the seeds of its own destruction. A society that views its own children as expendable resources will eventually run out of people willing to sacrifice everything for its continuation. The constant warfare, the abandonment of weak infants, the psychological destruction of survivors, all of this gradually eroded the human foundation that any society needs to survive. The Helots, who had been terrorized into submission for generations, eventually found opportunities to rebel as Spartan military power declined. Other Greek city-states, who had long resented Spartan arrogance and brutality, were eager to support these revolts. The Spartans found themselves isolated, surrounded by enemies they had created through centuries of cruelty and domination. But perhaps most tellingly, the Spartans themselves seemed to lose the will to continue their system. Later generations of Spartan parents began to resist sending their children to the agoge. The birth rate among Spartan citizens declined dramatically. It was as if the society was slowly committing suicide, unable to continue inflicting on their children what had been inflicted on them. This gradual abandonment of their own system reveals something profound about human nature. Despite centuries of conditioning, despite religious and cultural indoctrination, despite the powerful psychological mechanisms that perpetuate cycles of abuse, there remains some core of human decency that eventually rebelled against the systematic destruction of childhood. The Spartans couldn't completely erase their own humanity, and ultimately, that humanity reasserted itself. The archaeological evidence from later periods of Spartan history tells a story of gradual humanization. Burial practices became more individualized, suggesting that people were beginning to value personal identity over collective conformity. Art and decoration, previously discouraged, began to appear in Spartan homes. Children's toys and games, once forbidden as signs of weakness, started showing up in the archaeological record. These changes weren't signs of military decline, they were signs of psychological recovery. The Spartans were slowly healing from their collective trauma, rediscovering the human qualities that their system had tried to destroy. The fact that this recovery coincided with their loss of military dominance reveals the true cost of their warrior culture. They had to choose between being effective killers and being fully human, and they couldn't be both. Modern military organizations have studied Spartan methods extensively, and the conclusions are sobering. While extreme hardship can indeed produce soldiers who are physically tough and psychologically resilient, the Spartan approach goes far beyond what's necessary or effective. The systematic abuse, the deliberate destruction of emotional bonds, the complete suppression of individual identity, these elements don't create better soldiers. They create psychologically damaged people who happen to be good at fighting. Contemporary research on child development and trauma has confirmed what should have been obvious all along. Children need love, security, and emotional support to develop into healthy adults. The Spartan system violated every principle of healthy human development, and the results were predictable. They created a society of traumatized individuals who could only function within a very narrow and destructive framework. The lessons of Sparta extend far beyond military training. Any system that treats children as means to an end rather than as human beings worthy of love and protection will ultimately fail. Whether it's a military culture, a religious movement, a political ideology, or even an educational philosophy. The moment we start viewing children as raw material to be shaped rather than as individuals to be nurtured, we're walking down the same dark path that led to the agoge. This is why the Spartan example remains relevant today. We live in a world where children are still subjected to systematic abuse in the name of higher purposes. Child soldiers, religious extremist training, abusive athletic programs, academic pressure that drives children to suicide. These are all modern versions of the same fundamental error that defined Sparta. They all share the delusion that breaking a child's spirit will somehow make them stronger. The truth is exactly the opposite. Children become strong not by having their humanity stripped away, but by having it nurtured and protected. They become resilient not by learning to suppress their emotions, but by learning to understand and manage them. They become capable not by being isolated and terrorized, but by being loved and supported. The Spartans got it completely backward, and the results speak for themselves. Understanding the reality of Spartan childhood also helps us recognize the warning signs of similar systems in our own time. Whenever we hear rhetoric about toughening up children, about the weakness of modern youth, about the need for harsher discipline and more demanding standards, we should remember what those ideas led to in Sparta. There's a difference between challenging children to grow and systematically destroying their capacity for growth. The Spartan legacy in popular culture is particularly troubling because it continues to promote the same toxic ideas that made the agoge possible. Movies, books, and games that celebrate Spartan warriors without acknowledging the human cost of creating them are perpetuating dangerous myths about strength, courage, and human development. They're teaching new generations to admire the products of child abuse while ignoring the abuse itself. This cultural amnesia isn't accidental. It's easier to admire the warrior than to confront the abused child who was destroyed to create him. It's more comfortable to focus on battlefield heroics than on the systematic trauma that made those heroics possible. But this willful blindness makes us complicit in the same dehumanization that defined Spartan society. The boys who entered the agoge at age 7 weren't volunteers signing up for a challenging but rewarding experience. They were children being fed into a machine designed to destroy everything that made them human. The fact that some of them survived and even thrived within that system doesn't validate the system. It speaks to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, even under the most horrific conditions. Every child who died in the agoge, every boy who was broken by the training, every man who lived his entire life unable to form meaningful relationships or experience normal human emotions. These are the real costs of the Spartan system. They're not acceptable losses in pursuit of military excellence. They're human tragedies that should never be forgotten or romanticized. The Spartan experiment in human engineering ultimately failed because it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. The Spartans believed that strength came from suppressing weakness, that courage came from eliminating fear, that loyalty came from destroying individual identity. But real strength incorporates and transcends weakness. Real courage acknowledges and overcomes fear. Real loyalty grows from love and respect, not from terror and conditioning. A truly strong society doesn't need to break its children to function. It doesn't need to suppress human emotion to maintain order. It doesn't need to dehumanize its citizens to achieve its goals. The Spartans chose the path of trauma and control, and while it gave them temporary military advantage, it ultimately led to their destruction as a civilization. The children of Sparta deserved better. They deserved to grow up in a society that valued them as individuals, that nurtured their potential, that protected their innocence and fostered their growth. They deserved to become fully realized human beings, not just weapons in service of state power. The fact that they were denied this basic human right is the greatest tragedy of Spartan civilization. Today, we have the knowledge and resources to create societies that are both strong and humane, that can defend themselves without destroying their children, that can maintain order without suppressing human nature. We know that love is stronger than fear, that cooperation is more effective than domination, that healthy children grow into capable adults better than traumatized ones. The question is whether we'll learn from the Spartan example or repeat their mistakes. Will we choose to build societies that honor human dignity and protect childhood, or will we continue to sacrifice our children on the altar of adult ambitions? The boys of ancient Sparta can't be saved, but the children of today still can be. Their future depends on our willingness to reject the toxic legacy of the agoges and choose a more humane path forward. The psychological scars left by the agoge system extended far beyond the individual Spartan warriors themselves. These men, stripped of their capacity for normal human emotion and connection, returned to society as fathers, husbands, and leaders, carrying the weight of unprocessed trauma. They had learned that love was weakness, that vulnerability invited destruction, and that the only way to survive was to become the very thing that had terrorized them as children. Consider what this meant for Spartan families. Fathers who had been systematically brutalized could not provide the emotional warmth and security that children need to develop healthy attachment patterns. Instead, they perpetuated the cycle, viewing their own children through the lens of the state's needs rather than as individuals deserving of love and protection. The moment a Spartan boy was born, his father already knew that in 7 short years he would hand that child over to a system designed to break him. This knowledge poisoned even those brief early years, creating an emotional distance that served as a protective mechanism against the inevitable separation. Spartan women, though not subjected to the agoge themselves, lived within this traumatized society and often internalized its values. They were expected to celebrate when their sons were taken away, to show pride rather than grief when their children suffered, and to view their maternal instincts as potential weaknesses that could undermine the state's objectives. The famous Spartan mother's words, "Come back with your shield or on it," reveal not strength, but a complete surrendering of natural parental love to the demands of a militaristic ideology. The ripple effects of this systematic trauma created what we might recognize today as a society-wide form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Entire generations of Spartans lived with hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and an inability to form healthy relationships. They created art, literature, and cultural practices that glorified suffering and normalized cruelty. Their religious and social rituals reinforced the idea that human worth was measured solely by one's ability to endure pain and inflict it upon others. This collective trauma manifested in Sparta's relationships with other Greek city-states and their treatment of conquered peoples. The Helots, the enslaved population that supported Spartan society, bore the brunt of this institutionalized cruelty. Spartan warriors, having learned to dehumanize themselves and their peers, found it effortless to view the Helots as less than human. The annual declaration of war against the Helots, the ritual murders carried out by young Spartans as part of their training, and the systematic terrorization of this population all stemmed from the same psychological conditioning that began with abandoned infants on Mount Taygetus. The Crypteia, the secret police force composed of young Spartan men, represents perhaps the most chilling example of how childhood trauma becomes societal oppression. These young men, having survived the agoge's brutality, were given permission to hunt and kill helots with impunity. For many, this became their first taste of the power that came with being on the inflicting rather than receiving end of violence. The psychological relief of finally being the predator rather than the prey created a powerful addiction to dominance and control. But even for those who rose to the top of Spartan society, the cost was devastating. Archaeological evidence suggests that Spartan warriors suffered from chronic health problems related to malnutrition during their formative years. Their stunted growth, dental problems, and evidence of repeated injuries tell the story of bodies pushed beyond their limits during crucial developmental periods. The brain scans of modern individuals who experienced severe childhood trauma show measurable differences in structure and function, particularly in areas responsible for emotional regulation, empathy, and decision making. We can reasonably assume that similar changes occurred in Spartan brains, creating neurological patterns that reinforce the psychological conditioning of the agoge. The economic implications of this system were equally destructive. A society that dedicates its human resources entirely to warfare cannot sustain itself indefinitely. While Spartan warriors were learning to endure pain and follow orders, other Greek city-states were developing trade networks, advancing in mathematics and philosophy, and creating art that would influence civilization for millennia. Sparta's singular focus on military prowess left them increasingly isolated and economically dependent on slave labor and conquest. As other Greek states evolved and adapted to changing circumstances, Sparta remained trapped in the rigid patterns established by their traumatic child-rearing practices. The inability to innovate, to question authority, or to imagine alternative ways of organizing society ultimately led to their decline. When faced with new military technologies and tactics, Spartan warriors found themselves unprepared, not because they lacked courage or physical conditioning, but because their psychological conditioning had eliminated the very creativity and adaptability that could have helped them evolve. The fall of Sparta was not sudden, but gradual, a slow hemorrhaging of relevance as the world moved beyond the narrow confines of their militaristic vision. By the time of the Roman conquest, Sparta had become something of a living museum, maintaining the outward forms of their ancient practices while lacking the population and resources to make them meaningful. The agoge continued in some form, but it had become a performance for tourists rather than a genuine system of military preparation. Yet even as Sparta faded into historical obscurity, the psychological patterns they had established continued to influence human societies. The idea that strength comes from suffering, that emotional connection is weakness, and that the needs of the state supersede individual human dignity has appeared repeatedly throughout history. We see echoes of Spartan thinking in various totalitarian regimes, in certain military traditions, and in contemporary discussions about child rearing and education. The romanticization of Spartan culture in modern media reveals our continued fascination with the idea that extreme measures produce superior results. Movies, books, and video games often present the agoge as a harsh but effective system that created the ultimate warriors. This glorification ignores the human cost and perpetuates dangerous myths about the relationship between trauma and strength. Research in developmental psychology has conclusively demonstrated that children thrive when they feel safe, loved, and supported. The secure attachment relationships formed in early childhood provide the foundation for emotional regulation, empathy, and resilience throughout life. Children who experience consistent care and affection develop stronger immune systems, better cognitive abilities, and greater capacity for forming healthy relationships as adults. The Spartan model represents the complete opposite of what we now know about healthy child development. Every aspect of the agoge, from the early separation from parents to the systematic exposure to violence and deprivation, contradicts evidence based practices for raising psychologically healthy individuals. The fact that this system produced effective soldiers in the short term does not validate its methods any more than the temporary effectiveness of other harmful practices justifies their continuation. Modern military training, while still demanding and rigorous, has evolved to incorporate our understanding of human psychology and the importance of maintaining soldiers' humanity even while preparing them for combat. Effective military leaders recognize that soldiers who maintain their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning are actually more effective in complex modern conflicts than those who have been reduced to mere instruments of violence. The lessons of Sparta extend beyond military training to any system that treats children as means to an end rather than as individuals with inherent worth and dignity. Educational systems that prioritize test scores over student well being, athletic programs that normalize abuse in the name of building character, and parenting approaches that equate harshness with effectiveness all risk creating smaller versions of the trauma that defined Spartan society. Understanding the true cost of the agoge system helps us recognize the warning signs of institutional abuse in our own time. When we hear arguments that children need to be toughened up through deliberate exposure to cruelty, when we see systems that isolate children from their support networks in the name of building independence, or when we encounter ideologies that view compassion as weakness, we can recognize the echoes of Spartan thinking and respond with the knowledge that such approaches ultimately diminish rather than strengthen human potential. The most tragic aspect of the Spartan system was not just what it did to individual children, but what it prevented them from becoming. Each boy who entered the agoge carried within him the potential for creativity, compassion, wisdom, and joy. The systematic destruction of these qualities represented not just personal tragedies, but a massive waste of human potential. We can only imagine what contributions these individuals might have made to art, science, philosophy, or human understanding if they had been allowed to develop their full range of human capabilities. The archaeological record of Sparta is notably sparse compared to other Greek city-states. They left behind few works of art, literature, or philosophy that survived to influence later civilizations. Their contributions to human knowledge and culture were minimal compared to Athens, despite their military reputation. This cultural poverty was not accidental, but inevitable, given a system that systematically eliminated the psychological foundations necessary for creative and intellectual achievement. Perhaps most importantly, the Spartan example demonstrates that strength and resilience are not products of trauma, but of security and support. The warriors who fought at Thermopylae were not strong because they had been abused as children, but in spite of that abuse, their courage came from their bonds with each other, formed in the crucible of shared suffering. But imagine how much greater that courage might have been if those bonds had been forged through shared joy, mutual support, and genuine care for each other's well being. True resilience, the kind that allows individuals and societies to adapt and thrive in the face of challenges, comes from having a secure foundation of love and support to return to. Children who know they are valued for who they are, not just for what they can do, develop the internal resources necessary to face difficulties with confidence and creativity. They learn that setbacks are temporary, that they have inherent worth regardless of their performance, and that they can rely on others for support when needed. The Spartan system, by contrast, created a brittle form of strength that could not adapt to changing circumstances. When the rigid structures of their society were challenged, they had no internal resources to draw upon for innovation or flexibility. They had been trained to endure, but not to grow, to obey, but not to think, to fight, but not to build. As we face our own challenges in the modern world, the lessons of Sparta remind us that the choices we make about how we treat children have consequences that extend far beyond individual families. The way we structure our educational systems, our athletic programs, our youth organizations, and our families shapes not just the immediate experience of childhood, but the kind of society we will become. We have the opportunity to learn from Sparta's mistakes and choose a different path. We can create systems that honor children's inherent dignity while still preparing them for the challenges of adult life. We can build strength through support rather than suffering, resilience through security rather than trauma, and courage through love rather than fear. The children in our care today will become the leaders, parents, and citizens of tomorrow. The psychological patterns we establish in them through our treatment will ripple forward through generations, just as the trauma of the agoge rippled through Spartan society. We have the power to break cycles of harm and create cycles of healing instead. The story of Spartan childhood is ultimately a cautionary tale about the importance of remembering our humanity, even in the pursuit of strength and excellence. It reminds us that no goal, however noble it may seem, justifies the systematic destruction of a child's capacity for love, joy, and compassion. It challenges us to examine our own practices and beliefs about child rearing and to ensure that we are building up rather than breaking down the human potential entrusted to our care. The abandoned infants of Mount Tagetus, the terrified 7-year-olds torn from their families, the brutalized adolescents learning to inflict pain on others, these children deserved better. They deserved to be seen as individuals with inherent worth, to be loved unconditionally, and to have their natural human qualities nurtured rather than destroyed. We cannot change their fate, but we can honor their memory by ensuring that the children in our care today receive the love, support, and respect that every child deserves. The question isn't really whether you could survive a Spartan childhood, but whether you'd want to survive what you'd become afterward. The agoge didn't just create warriors, it created walking shells of human beings, perfectly calibrated for violence, but utterly incapable of the connections that make life worth living. Every graduate of this system carried invisible scars that never healed, wounds that shaped not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. Consider what happened to these men when they returned to civilian life. They were expected to marry, to father children, to participate in society, but they had been systematically stripped of every quality that makes those relationships meaningful. How do you love when you've been taught that love is weakness? How do you show tenderness to your own children when tenderness was beaten out of you before you could walk properly? How do you form genuine friendships when your earliest memories of friendship involved betrayal and competition for survival? The tragic irony is that Sparta's military supremacy was built on a foundation that ultimately weakened the very society it was meant to protect. While other Greek city-states were producing philosophers, artists, scientists, and innovators, Sparta was producing only soldiers. Their educational system was so narrow, so focused on creating killing machines, that it failed to develop the intellectual and creative capacities that societies need to truly thrive and adapt. This single-minded focus on military prowess created a brittle civilization. When the world changed around them, when new military technologies emerged, when different forms of warfare developed, Sparta couldn't adapt. Their entire identity was locked into one mode of being, one way of thinking, one definition of strength. They had created a society of specialists so specialized that they became obsolete. But the human cost was even greater than the civilizational one. Every child who entered the agoge was a potential poet, inventor, healer, or teacher. Every creative impulse was crushed. Every moment of curiosity was punished. Every display of empathy was met with violence. Imagine the collective loss of human potential, the innovations that were never made, the beauty that was never created, the kindness that was never shown. The Spartan system also reveals something disturbing about how quickly humans can normalize the most extreme forms of cruelty when they're presented as tradition or necessity. Parents who had themselves survived the agoge would willingly hand over their 7-year-old sons to face the same trauma they had endured. The victims became the perpetrators, and the cycle continued generation after generation. This normalization of brutality extended beyond the training camps. Spartan society as a whole became desensitized to suffering. The public humiliation of the weak, the abandonment of disabled infants, the systematic abuse of children, all of this was not just accepted, but celebrated as virtue. They had created a culture where cruelty was confused with strength, where the absence of compassion was mistaken for courage. Modern research in psychology and neuroscience has shown us exactly what the Spartans were doing to these children's developing brains. Chronic stress and trauma in childhood literally reshape the neural pathways, creating adults who are hypervigilant, emotionally dysregulated, and unable to form secure attachments. The Spartans accidentally discovered how to create what we now recognize as complex trauma responses, and they mistook the symptoms for strength. The sleep deprivation, constant fear, unpredictable violence, and emotional neglect that defined the agoge are now understood to be the perfect recipe for developmental trauma. These children's brains were being rewired to survive in a world of constant threat, which made them effective in combat, but utterly unprepared for peace, love, or happiness. What makes the Spartan system particularly insidious is how it weaponized natural human needs, children's desperate hunger for approval, their need for belonging, their desire to make their parents proud. All of these healthy impulses were twisted into tools of control. The system didn't just inflict trauma, it made children complicit in their own traumatization by convincing them it was for their own good. This is perhaps the most important lesson for our modern world. We still live in societies that sometimes confuse harshness with strength, that mistake emotional suppression for resilience, that believe children need to be broken down before they can be built up. The Spartan example shows us where this logic leads when taken to its extreme. True strength comes from security, not fear. Real resilience develops when children feel safe enough to take risks, fail, and try again. Genuine courage emerges from love and connection, not from the absence of those things. The strongest adults are those who were nurtured as children, who learned that they were valuable not for what they could do or endure, but simply for who they were. The Spartan legacy serves as a warning about the seductive nature of systems that promise to create superior human beings through suffering. These systems always have their defenders, people who point to their apparent success while ignoring their hidden costs. They focus on the warriors who emerged from the agoge while forgetting the children who died along the way, the potential that was squandered, the humanity that was lost. In our own time, we face similar temptations. There are always voices calling for tougher discipline, harsher consequences, more rigorous training. There are always those who believe that children today are too soft, too protected, too coddled. The Spartan example reminds us that there is no glory in breaking children, no honor in creating systems that dehumanize the vulnerable in service of some greater good. The ultimate tragedy of Sparta is not that their system was cruel, but that it was unnecessary. Human beings are naturally capable of incredible courage, loyalty, and sacrifice when these qualities emerge from love rather than fear. History is full of examples of ordinary people who performed extraordinary acts of heroism, not because they were trained to be emotionless killing machines, but because they were fighting for something they cared about deeply. The haunting truth about Spartan childhood is that it wasn't designed to create truly strong individuals, but rather broken ones who mistook their trauma for strength. When we examine the agoge system today, we see a perfect case study in how systematic abuse can masquerade as character building, and how entire societies can convince themselves that cruelty is necessary for survival. The children who endured this system didn't emerge as heroes. They emerged as hollow shells programmed for violence. They lost their capacity for genuine relationships, creative problem solving, and emotional intelligence. These weren't strengths that made Sparta invincible. They were fatal weaknesses that ultimately contributed to its downfall. A society that cannot adapt, innovate, or form meaningful alliances is doomed to stagnation. Perhaps most disturbing is how the victims became willing participants in perpetuating their own suffering. The boys who survived the agoge didn't question its brutality. They embraced it, ensuring that future generations would endure the same dehumanization. This is the insidious nature of normalized trauma. It creates defenders of the very system that destroyed them. Today, we still encounter echoes of Spartan ideology in cultures that worship toughness above all else, that shame vulnerability, and that mistake emotional suppression for strength. The lesson from ancient Sparta is clear. True resilience comes not from breaking the human spirit, but from nurturing it. Societies that prioritize compassion, emotional intelligence, and human dignity don't just survive, they thrive. The Spartan experiment in human engineering was ultimately a failure, a cautionary tale about what happens when we forget that our greatest strength as humans isn't our ability to endure suffering, but our capacity to love, create, and connect with one another. That's why you wouldn't survive a Spartan childhood, and more importantly, why you shouldn't have to.